Let's now, for completeness, look at finding more realistic, or rather more difficult, percentages of values that don't just conveniently end in 0, just so you can see how it's done. As I said in the first video, this particular skill you do not need for the first year exam, but it is a skill that you might want to brush up on at some later point. Okay, so let's do an example. Let's try and find 32% of 124. Now, I'm still wanting to think about the 10% 5% rule, but we're going to need one other percentage for our menu in our toolbox, and that is the 1% rule. So let's see what that is. Well, we know, going back to basics, that 10% of a number that's close to this, say 120, is equal to 12. And another way we can think of this is, knowing that 10% means divide by 10, you could have thought of that as moving the, in this case, invisible decimal one place to the left. So applying 10% of 124, we can now say, okay, I want to find divide by 10, so move the decimal place one place to the left on the whole number 124, and I can see now that my answer for 10% of 124 is 12.4. Now we can move to 1%. The 1% rule, well, 1% means divide by 100, and we're going to have a similar line of thinking. Think of 1% of 100. That number ends in 2 zeros, and divided by 100 is the same as taking 2 zeros off, which is just equal to 1. Or we could think of the divide by 100 visually as moving the decimal places 2 places to the left, and you can see now that instead of writing 1, I could have written it as 1.0, which is of course the same as 1. So whilst 10% of a number that doesn't end in 0, you move 1 place to the left, 1% of a number that doesn't end in 2 zeros, 2 places to the left. Let's make that number a little more tricky. 1% of 120. This is a number close to 124, but not quite there. I'm just going to apply my move 2 places to the left rule, and you can now see that 10% of 120 is 1.20. I don't need this final 0, what's called a trailing 0, so I can put it as 1.2. The idea of the trailing 0 has already been seen here in the 1.00, and now here in the 1.20. Any 0 at the far right after the decimal of any decimal value can safely be ignored. So finally we can write 1% of 124. I'm going to move my decimal place 2 places to the left because I'm finding 1%, and I can now readily see that that equals to 1.24. So we have our two key values, 10% of 124 and 1% of 124. Okay, let's now use the idea of the menu. Well, we want 3 10% and 2 1%. So I'm just going to write those down so we can then do our addition. Stick the values in place. So the 10% was just equal to 12.4. So let me write that down 3 times. I'm trying to be careful to align that decimal because I know I'm going to be adding in a moment. 1% was 1.24. So again, keeping the decimal aligned, I'll have to think about what to do with the gaps in a moment. And now to find the answer, I simply need to add those up. Now because of this gap here above those 4s, I'm going to put some zeros there just so I don't make any mistakes. Okay, let's add it all up. Before doing so, I'll simply put my decimal there. 0, 0, 0, well that's just 0, and 4 and 4 is 8. Then I've got 3 4s there, which is 12. and 2 which is 14 and 2 which is 16, 6 down carry 1, and then we have 2, 4, 6, 7, 8 and the 1 I carried is 9, and then 3, 1, 2, 3. So the answer to 32% of 124 is 39.68. It's far more involved, isn't it, than finding 10% of a number that ends in 0, or finding a percentage which is a multiple of 5%, because in that case the 10% 5% rule was pretty much straightforward. But you can see a very similar principle applies to finding any percent of any values. You just have to take a little more care, and certainly just be on the ball about whether you're moving one place or two places with the decimal. Now before I set you a question to do yourself, I want to do one more exercise with you. Let's do 67% of 325. Well, 10% of 325. I'm just going to move the decimal one place to the left because it's the 10% rule. So we can see that 10% of 325 equals 32.5. We'll want 1% as well. Before doing that, I'm going to think about this. Do I need to add 10% 6 times? I think what I'm going to do here is multiply that value by 6. And of course, in order to do that, what one does is one ignores the decimal point and put it back in later. I'm just going to get rid of that decimal point just for a moment. 5 times 6 is 30, so that's 0 down carry 3. 2 6s are 12, and the 3 is 15. 5 down carry 1, and 3 6s are 18, and the 1 is 19. Put the decimal point back in. There it is. So I can therefore say that 60%, I will keep this in red, 60% of 325 equals 195. I'm ignoring that trailing 0, and I will put that dot back in there so that if you look at the final screenshot you're not going to be confused. Okay, that's the 60% part. Let's now do the 7 lots of 1%. Well, that's straightforward because we know from the 1% rule that to find 1% of a number, like 1% of 325, we simply move the decimal place 2 places to the left, and we can therefore see that 1% of 325 is 3.25. We now want to find, let me just create some space here, we now want to find 7%. Well, 7% must be 3.25 times 7. So I'll ignore the decimal, 325 times 7. I'm using the column method here. Then I'll put the decimal back in once I finish. 5 7s is 35, 5 down carry 3. 2 7s is 14, and the 3 is 17, 7 down carry 1. 3 7s is 21, and the 1 is 22. Put the decimal back in. Well, that must go in 2 places from the right, so it's 22.75. So let's write that in. Let's write in that 7% of 325 equals 22.75, and it only remains for us to combine those two together. The 60% was 195, the 7% was 22.75. Got a decimal added to a whole number there, so I'm going to put a 0.00 to the one above. Line up the dots. 0 and 5 is 5, and 0 and 7 is 7. 5 and 2 is also 7, and 9 plus 2 is 11, 1 down carry 1, and 1 plus 1 is 2. So we can see that our final answer of 67% of 325 is equal to 217.75. Again, a lot of work. I would much rather be doing this with the calculator, but this is for illustration purpose only, to convince you that it is possible to work out any percent of any value without a calculator, but clearly with a lot of care. Okay, final task, and this one is for you to do. Here is an exercise. There are 3 questions for you to do. I'm going to invite you to pause the video in a moment, have a little go yourself at one or all of them without a calculator, and then once you've depressed pause, I will then release the answers. Okay, here's the answers. If you're close to the answer, just go back and check your work. It's likely to be a small arithmetic error. If you're a long way out, it's likely that you have misused the 10% or the 1% rule. I don't have any other examples of this as an exercise for you on the Moodle site, but certainly if you think about it, you can make them up yourself, and you can always check with a calculator what the answer is. Well, I hope that's been of some use, and I hope that has helped deepen your understanding of the topic of finding the percentage of a value. Thank you very much.